discussion. So next we have analyzing electric micromobility amongst equity deserving communities in Canadian cities by Ignacio Tiznado-Aitken from University of China. Ignacio, over to you.
Thank you so much, Amir, for the introduction. Can you see my screen correctly?
Yeah.
Yes.
Great. Well, hi everyone. Thanks for being here today and for your interest in our symposium. We are really happy as a team to have such high attendance in our sessions today. Today I will be presenting some preliminary results of a research project that a former student and now a Metrolinx employee, Danuka, has been exploring under my supervision, which is the analysis of electric micromobility use amongst equity-deserving communities in Canadian cities. Danuka was not able to join to provide himself the presentation, so I will be representing our work here today, although he deserves all the credit. Just to start off the presentation and to be sure that we are on the same page, we understand micromobility as vehicles that are usually small, lightweight, and typically used for shared trips. They are relatively low speed, although some of them can get up to 30 kilometers an hour. And in this presentation, we will talk about electric micromobility, and from now on, you will see in the slides referred as EMM. And we'll be referring to electric micromobility as these electric powered transportation devices, including e-bikes and e-scooters. So despite their growth over time, these vehicles can still be classified as emerging mobility options, and their branding or promise in the past, let's say 8 to 10 years ago, was associated with alternatives to disrupt the car, mainly for short trips, as I mentioned in the definition before. Therefore, obviously, the adoption has been associated with important economic, environmental, and social benefits, particularly when we think about low carbon and just transitions, especially if you are able to increase transportation alternatives at affordable prices. However, what we have been seeing so far in the literature is that the profile of e-micromobility users mimics the typical characteristics of early adopters of new technologies or transportation innovations. That means most users are males, middle-aged, and highly educated individuals who mostly use these transportation options for leisure trips and more recently for commuting trips, especially among younger users. While the Canadian evidence is kind of sparse and not consolidated yet, we have some initial ideas on where the main gaps are. First of all, there are clear gaps in the legislation and regulation and implementation related to electric micromobility, from inconsistent definitions to cities where certain modes are banned or have certain restrictions to operate in combination with transit. And if we look at the evidence in terms of use of these modes, some recent and very interesting evidence in more medium and small cities, we found that, for example, in Windsor, kind of show a profile that kind of aligns with what I mentioned before, like these trends worldwide, highlighting short distances, leisure trips, and higher incomes. But Brampton, for example, in the other hand, shows some interesting nuances. Like, for example, shared e-scooters are more used in neighborhoods with higher instability, higher concentration of racialized group, and higher concentration of immigration groups. So having kind of presented this very synthetic summary of existing evidence, we found some key gaps that might require kind of our attention and deserves further research. First of all, a national framework for these devices, as well as some kind of guide for implementation and use of them in Canadian context. Second, of course, large-scale data sets that allows us to size the use of micromobility, among whom and how this differ by different cities. Third, we don't have a lot of data that can point us to usage frequency and barriers to adoption, especially for those who declare being interested in these modes. And finally, we lack detailed origin destination patterns of e-micromobility users, since many of our existing origin destination surveys do not explicitly cover this transportation option as they are still emerging. And if they are considered at all, sometimes they are aggregated with other forms of active transportation, such as conventional cycling. So in this presentation, I will cover some advances in the last three bullet points related to large-scale evidence and more fine-grained analysis in one particular city. So let's start with this kind of like national perspective on electric micromobility. We had two main research questions here. The first one was related to the current rates of electric micromobility use across different Canadian cities, asking ourselves is if equity deserving groups are more or less prevalent in their use. And the second one was linked to the main barriers for those who would like to use these electric micromobility options. So to answer these questions, we use the MJ National Survey on Transport Poverty. In particular, we use like two sets of questions. The first one is how often like people traveling by different transportation modes, and we filtered those especially for e-bikes and e-scooters. We were able to classify each respondent into one category of use from high, which is a few times a week, to almost daily, to no use at all. That is like they never or rarely use the mode itself. The second set of questions aim to explore modal dissonance, which is like pretty much related with what Mackenzie just presented, but for our specific transportation modes. So for every person stating that e-bikes or e-scooters will be their preferred mode, and it didn't match their most frequent mode, we analyzed the main reasons behind it to identify these barriers for adoption, specifically for these modes, as I said before. So the analysis was done for 26 Canadian cities, which had at least 350 responses in our survey. The social demographic characteristics that we consider were gender, age, ethnicity, low income cutoff before tax, and immigration status. And for this exploratory analysis, we produce weighted descriptive statistics using an R package that allows us to kind of use the weights of our survey just to have like this population weighted descriptive statistics. And then we perform some chi-square tests for testing how relevant are different social demographic variables when we are looking at these rates of use for these two modes. So let's quickly review some of the key results on e-bike use across these 26 Canadian cities in our study. We observed a substantial variation between cities, with total e-bike use ranging from like roughly 4 to 5% in some cities to more than 15% in others. In most cities, the largest group is the still like low frequency users. Remember that we did that classification before. So that suggests that while adoption is kind of growing in Canadian cities, like regular or intensive use remains very limited at the moment. However, of course, some cities, including Vancouver or Quebec City, show much stronger shares of high frequency users, pointing to more kind of established patterns of everyday e-bike travel. We also see notable levels of medium and high use in more suburban municipalities, for example, Burnaby or Surrey, where e-bikes might help replace car trips. And in contrast, some cities such as Winnipeg or Halifax continue to show very low levels of regular use of e-bikes. So now comparing kind of the same kind of graph, but now for e-scooters, we found that e-scooter usage levels are generally lower than those observed for e-bikes, with the highest use cities reaching around 10 to 11%. Edmonton and Vancouver show the strongest overall adoption, followed closely by Brampton and Richmond. Across nearly all cities, occasional and low frequency users represent the largest share, as like similar to e-bikes, as I mentioned before, while this high frequency use remains relatively limited, under 3%. The graph also suggests something interesting, that is a stronger geographic clustering for e-scooter adoption. compared to e-bikes, particularly for Western Canadian cities, which might point to differences in local regulations, infrastructure provision, shared micromobility programs, or urban form. So now moving into our equity analysis and these like user profiles, I don't want to overwhelm you with like a lot of numbers for each case. So I would just like to highlight some main statistically significant differences in our analysis. So first of all, we found that recent immigrants are more likely to use both modes compared to long-term immigrants and Canadian-born individuals. We found that men are more likely to use both modes compared to women. Indigenous groups and visible minorities are more likely to use both modes compared to white individuals as well. Younger groups are more likely to use both e-scooters and e-bikes compared to older groups over 45 years old. And an interesting result is that we didn't find like any statistically significant difference in terms of income, although we found a slightly higher use of lower income groups in our sample. So finally, let's highlight some of the main barriers limiting the adoption of electric micromobility modes in Canada. At the national level, both e-bikes and e-scooters still represent a relatively small share of that preferred transportation mode. E-bikes just account for 1.7% and e-scooters only 0.6%. For e-bikes, the main concerns relate to convenience, safety, and less so affordability. For e-scooters, concerns are more kind of like evenly distributed across safety, affordability, and speed, especially if you consider that this is not like as fast as other transportation alternatives. And an interesting finding is that preferred e-bike users tend to rely heavily on automobiles for their regular travel, while preferred e-scooter users are more closely connected to public transportation use. And this might suggest that the two modes might play different roles when we think about like urban mobility systems as a whole. So now let's move into a more specific case, the Toronto perspective. Here in this section of the analysis, we also had two main questions. Again, we wanted to explore who was making these like e-micromobility trips and if there were like any important social demographic differences, and also being able to analyze a little bit the spatial patterns of these trips, both in terms of origins and destinations, but also potential routes that those users might be using at the moment. And the data that we used to answer these questions was the Transportation Tomorrow survey. It is the origin destination survey in the GTHA. This survey has been running since the 80s, every 5 years, and its content has been evolving over time. In the last version, that it was 2022, 2023, several key changes happened in the survey. Some changes related to like categories or the modes available, the trips that were accounted for like in the survey. But I would like to focus in three main things. The first thing is that e-scooters and other forms of electric micromobility were included as an option as primary mode of the trip for the first time. A gender diverse category was added also for the first time, and questions related to immigration and ethnic origin were also incorporated for the first time, allowing us to do a more refined equity analysis. And why this is relevant? Because like if you kind of see official TTS reports, they usually show like a growth in the bicycle and other forms of micromobility over time. But now we have access to like this disaggregated data to see how like electric micromobility modes have been like are present nowadays in our cities because they were captured for the first time in a disaggregated way. Actually, in 2022, for example, current counts in Toronto already reflected that e-bikes and e-scooters were like seated at 14% of the total observed micromobility types, even though e-scooters are not allowed in Toronto. So it's like very interesting to see kind of like more official statistics on that. So let's jump into the results itself. What we found here only at a descriptive level for now, and we're planning in next steps to do more on the statistical side of things. It's pretty consistent with the results that I showed using the MJ National Survey of Transport Poverty. So young adults, indigenous groups, and temporary residents show higher rates of use. And we found no differences in terms of income. Using the TTS, we found that non-binary individuals, so this new gender diverse category that was included, also show a higher use of these modes, which is also consistent with our findings at the national level, but they were not statistically significant in our analysis. And in addition, here is that consistent with evidence, for example, in Windsor and in other cities elsewhere in other parts of the world, it seems that most of these trips are for leisure and non-work trips. In terms of spatial patterns, we can identify from where electric micromobility trips start and where they end, which shows, of course, like a concentration in the city of Toronto itself, but also some spots in suburban areas. So more relevant than disaggregators is that we can try to see which routes are used for these trips. So the map that I'm showing here highlight the concentration of overlapping electric micromobility route segments across Toronto. And what stands out immediately is a strong clustering in the downtown core, where the highest overlap categories are concentrated along a relatively small number of corridors. And as we move forward toward like more suburban areas, the overlap becomes much lower and more dispersed, suggesting, of course, like less concentrated travel patterns outside the core. Although we observe at least like some small number of corridors experiencing medium and medium high levels of overlap. These findings also help identify eventual priority areas where cycling or micromobility infrastructure investment could have like the greatest impact. As I said, this is still like work in progress, so there's like a lot much more to come in future analysis. So to wrap up, I would like to leave you with five key takeaways from this presentation. First of all, like the overall adoption of electric micromobility remains relatively low, with fewer than 5% of respondents reporting high use of e-bikes or e-scooters. At the same time, there's a clear potential for growth, as many cities show that 10 to 15% of respondents are like in these medium and low use categories. We also identify several key barriers limiting adoption, particularly concerns around safety, convenience, affordability, and speed. In terms of user profiles, the patterns generally reflect what has been observed internationally, although there are some nuances that are interesting to further explore related to gender, immigration status, and ethnicity, as I mentioned in my findings. And finally, the spatial analysis showed like a strong concentration of use in downtown areas, alongside more sparse and dispersed pattern in suburban parts of the city that, of course, required further analysis. That's all. Thanks for your attention and happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much. Very interesting research. So let's see if there's any comment or question from audience.
Yeah, I'm just like looking at the comment from Susan in the
Yeah.
chat, which is, yeah, actually very interesting. One thing that I didn't mention because I think it was not the focus of the presentation is that we also are like nowadays like making an analysis of analyzing a little bit like the legislation, regulation, and everything that I mentioned that is kind of like the framework where like these electric micromobility devices operate in different cities. And it would be interesting if like those have like some sort of relationship with the rates that we're observing at the moment, both using like the Toronto case, but also like the MJ survey. And I think what you mentioned here about like kind of analyzing the availability of different modes, because like we have a huge range of electric micromobility options now, like privately owned, but also shared, and kind of like that maturity of those programs as well might reflect or might provide some insights on how is that connected with the rates that we're observing at the moment.
Okay, thanks so much.